Stop. Listen to those words. You've sung them 1,000 times. But do you have any idea what you are actually saying? To you, this is a lullaby. A sweet song about a generous sheep sharing its wool. But you've been lied to. What you are hearing isn't a nursery rhyme. It is a 700-year-old scream for help. It is a coded message, smuggled through centuries of history, describing a tax system so brutal it left entire villages starving in the mud. To the medieval families who wrote this, Baa Baa Black Sheep wasn't entertainment. It was a survival manual. It was a way to whisper a dangerous truth in plain sight without getting executed for treason. They wrapped their suffering in a melody so catchy that even the people oppressing them would hum along, never realizing they were the villains of the song. Once you understand the math hidden in these innocent verses, the cute story falls apart. The master isn't a farmer, the dame isn't a nice lady, and the little boy down the lane isn't getting a gift, he's getting robbed. By the end of this video, you will never be able to hear this song the same way again, because this isn't a story about sharing. It's the true story of a medieval heist. To understand the heist, you first have to understand the desperation of the thief. The master in our rhyme wasn't a fictional character. He was a real man, with a real face and a terrifying reputation. His name was Edward I, also known as Edward Longshanks, and in the summer of 1274, he was returning home to England not as a hero, but as a man with a noose tightening around his neck. Edward had just spent years fighting in the Ninth Crusade. In the history books, crusades are painted as holy missions of glory. In reality, they were financial black holes. War is expensive. War in the desert, thousands of miles from home, is ruinous. Edward had drained the royal treasury to pay for ships, mercenaries, armor, and supplies. He had borrowed against the crown jewels. He had promised gold he didn't have. And what did he have to show for it? Very little. He wasn't bringing back caravan loads of Saracen gold. He wasn't bringing back the Holy Grail. He was coming home to a coronation, but his pockets were empty. And waiting for him on the docks weren't just cheering subjects, there were creditors. These weren't just any creditors. Edward owed a fortune to the Riccardi family of Lucca. The Riccardi were the masters of medieval finance, powerful Italian bankers who controlled the flow of money across Europe. They had funded Edward's holy war, banking on his victory. Now they wanted their return. The debt was staggering. In modern terms, the English crown was essentially insolvent. Picture the scene in Westminster in late 1274. The Great Hall is being prepared for Edward's coronation feast. It is a spectacle of wealth, fountains flowing with wine, thousands of guests, servants carrying roasted boars. It is a performance of power, but behind the tapestries, in the private chambers, the mood is panicked. Edward's advisors are sweating. The king needs money, and he needs it immediately. If he defaults on the Italian loans, the credit of the English state collapses. The mercenaries stop fighting. The castles stop being built. The king loses his power. Edward was a ruthless tactician. He looked at his kingdom not as a land of people, but as a balance sheet. He asked his council, "Where is the money?" They couldn't tax the land any further. The barons would revolt. They couldn't tax the food. The peasants were already subsistence farming. But then, one advisor likely pointed out the window. England didn't have gold mines like Africa. It didn't have the spice trade like the East. But it had something the rest of the world was addicted to. Whatever direction you looked in 13th century England, from the Cotswolds to the Yorkshire Dales, you saw the same thing. Sheep. Millions of them. In the Middle Ages, wool was the oil of the economy. It was white gold. And English wool was the best in the world. It was finer, stronger, and softer than anything produced on the continent. The great textile cities of Flanders and Florence couldn't function without it. Their entire economies depended on weaving English wool into the luxury cloth that dressed the popes and emperors of Europe. Edward realized he was sitting on a monopoly. The world needed his sheep. And up until this moment, the trade had been relatively free. Farmers shore their sheep, sold the wool to merchants, and everyone made a living. Edward saw this flowing river of commerce and decided to build a dam. In 1275, The trap was sprung. Edward enacted a statute that would change history and ruin lives. It was called the Great Custom. The name sounds dignified, doesn't it? A custom, like a tradition. It was actually a stranglehold. The law was brutally simple. It declared that no sack of wool could leave the shores of England without the king taking his cut first. He set a tax on every single sack exported. But this wasn't a small sales tax. This wasn't a 5% surcharge. To pay off the Italian bankers, Edward needed massive margins. He positioned his tax collectors at every port: London, Boston, Southampton. Nothing left the island without the king's seal. And to pay for that seal, the merchants had to pay a premium. Now, here is where the economics of the nursery rhyme kick in. The merchants who bought the wool from the farmers weren't going to pay this tax out of their own pockets. They were businessmen. When the king demanded a massive tax on top, the merchants simply lowered the price they paid to the shepherds. The cost was passed down the line, crashing onto the shoulders of the people who could afford it the least. The king demanded his share. The church, as always, demanded its tithe, 10% of everything, right off the top. The merchant took his cut. And the shepherd? The man who walked the hills in the freezing rain? The man who birthed the lambs and fought off the wolves? He was left with the scraps. The Great Custom was a masterstroke of political survival for Edward. It saved the crown. It paid the Italians. It built the castles that still stand in Wales today. But for the families in the countryside, it was an apocalypse. Edward had solved his bankruptcy by outsourcing it to his people. He had turned the entire nation into a machine to pay his debts. And as the winter of 1275 approached, the shepherds realized that after the master and the dame took their shares, there might not be enough left to keep their children alive. And so, they began to sing. But they weren't singing nonsense. They were reciting a receipt. When you look at the lyrics of Baa Baa, Black Sheep, through the lens of 1275, the innocence evaporates. What remains is a precise, mathematical breakdown of medieval extortion. It is a ledger of who took what, hidden in a rhythm a child could remember. Let's decode the cipher, line by line. Baa, Baa, Black Sheep, have you any wool? Yes, sir, 3 bags full. 3 bags. This isn't a random number chosen for the rhyme scheme. In the medieval economy, the 3 bags represented the total productivity of the shepherd. This was the harvest. The entire year's work, sheared, sorted, and bagged, ready for market. To the shepherd, those 3 bags meant food, firewood, and survival for the coming winter. But the rhyme immediately tells us that those bags don't belong to him. He is just the custodian. The distribution has already been decided by powers far above his station, one for the master. There is no ambiguity here. In 1275, there was only one master who mattered. This is King Edward I. Under the crushing weight of the new wool tax, the first third of the value was effectively seized by the crown, whether through direct taxation or the artificial price suppression caused by the export ban. The king took the lion's share. Think about that. Imagine working for an entire year, waking up before dawn, laboring in the mud, birthing lambs in the snow, only to have the government seize 33% of your gross product before you've even sold a single ounce. This was the master's portion. It went to build the walls of Conway Castle. It went to pay the Italian bankers. It went everywhere except back to the village that produced it. One for the dame. For centuries, people have assumed the dame was the master's wife, a nice lady, a queen perhaps. But in the coded language of the peasantry, the dame was often a reference to the church, the bride of Christ. The church was the other great authority in medieval life, and it was just as hungry as the king. Through the system of tithes, the church demanded its own cut of the harvest. In theory, a tithe is 10%. But in practice, when you add in the fees for land use, often owned by monasteries, the cost of blessings, and the mandatory donations, the church's hand was always extended. The dame took the second bag. The wealth flowed into the abbeys and cathedrals, funding the soaring Gothic arches that still dot the English landscape today. Those beautiful buildings were paid for with the second bag of wool. and one for the little boy who lives down the lane. And here is the tragedy. Who is the little boy? He is the farmer. He is the shepherd. He is the grown man who did all the work. By referring to himself as the little boy, the author of the rhyme is acknowledging his own powerlessness. In the eyes of the feudal system, he is a minor. He has no voice, no vote, and no authority. He is a child in his own house, waiting for the grown-ups, the king and the church, to finish eating before he is allowed to scrape the plate. He keeps one bag, 1/3. He does 100% of the work, and he keeps 33% of the reward. That is the math of feudalism. But there is one final detail in the cipher that most people miss. The rhyme asks specifically for a black sheep. Why black? Today, we use the term black sheep to mean an outcast or a failure. But in the 13th century, a black sheep was a prize. In the great trading halls of Bruges and Florence, black wool was a luxury commodity. Unlike white wool, which had to be dyed with expensive roots and berries to achieve color, black wool was naturally dark. It could be woven immediately into rich, dark cloth. Flemish merchants called it the devil's fleece because it was so rare and absorbed the light so beautifully. They paid a premium for it. The irony is sharp enough to cut. The rhyme specifies a black sheep because the tax collectors didn't just take any wool. They targeted the best wool. The shepherd was raising the medieval equivalent of a Ferrari. Yet he was forced to walk. He was producing the fabric that clothed the nobility of Europe in elegant black, while he himself shivered in rough, undyed homespun. The sad, dark secret isn't just about money. It's about the theft of excellence. The system was designed to strip the farmer of his most valuable creation, leaving him with just enough to survive so he could do it all again next year. The rhyme is a record of that theft. It's a forensic accounting of how 3 bags of gold were turned into 2 bags of tax and 1 bag of survival. But numbers on a screen are sterile. They are clean. They don't make you shiver. To truly understand why this rhyme survived for 700 years, you have to leave the ledger books of London and walk into the mud of the north. You have to stand in the shoes of that little boy down the lane. Let's go to the winter of 1276. History records this era as a time of glorious castle building, but for the rural peasantry of northern England, it was a time of quiet desperation. The great custom had been in effect for a full season. The wool had been sheared. The tax collectors had come and gone, and now the consequences were setting in. Picture this child. He isn't a metaphor. He isn't a cartoon character in a nursery book. He is a real 6-year-old boy living in a village that has just been economically gutted. His father is a shepherd. He works harder than any modern industrial machine. But this year, after the king took his third and the church took its third, the math of survival has stopped working. That final bag, the one for the little boy, was supposed to be traded for everything else the family needed. It was their currency. It was meant to buy grain for bread. It was meant to buy salt to preserve meat. It was meant to buy firewood. But because the market price had crashed due to the king's export tax, that single bag bought almost nothing. When the rhyme mentions the little boy down the lane, it sounds quaint, but in 1276, that boy was standing barefoot on a floor of packed earth, understanding with the terrifying clarity that only hunger brings, that there would be no dinner tonight, and probably no dinner tomorrow. His tears weren't poetic. They were the salt, bitter tears of starvation. Medieval records from this period are fragmented, but if you look closely at parish registries in wool-producing regions during the years following the Great Custom, you see a spike in mortality. That's the polite historian's word for it. The reality was that thousands of children, the very children singing these songs, simply didn't wake up when the spring finally came. They were the collateral damage of King Edward's war debts. So, what do? You are a peasant in feudal England. You are watching the fruit of your labor being carted away by armed men while your children grow thinner by the day. You want to scream. You want to march into the town square and denounce the king as a thief. You want to tell the bishop that his dame is a parasite, but you can't. In the 13th century, speaking out against the king wasn't just protest, it was treason. It was sedition. If you stood on a soapbox and criticized the royal tax, you wouldn't just be fined. You would be put in the stocks. You might be branded. Or, if the local sheriff was feeling particularly loyal, you would be hanged. The silence in those villages wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of people holding their tongues to keep their heads. But human beings have a need to speak the truth. When you tape a man's mouth shut, he will learn to speak with his eyes. When you forbid him from writing a manifesto, he will write a song. This is the genius of Baa Baa, Black Sheep. It was born in this crucible of silence. Imagine a mother in that hut. She hears the creak of the wagon wheels taking their livelihood away. She can't shout, "Thief!" at the soldiers, they would arrest her husband. So, she hums. She puts the tragedy into a rhythm. She turns the tax law into a melody. One for the master, one for the dame. She teaches it to her children, to the soldiers passing by. It sounds like a sweet, harmless lullaby. A mother comforting her child. Look, the soldiers might think. The peasants are singing about their sheep. How quaint. They didn't hear the sarcasm. They didn't hear the accusation hidden in the syllables. This was subversion disguised as nursery nonsense. It was a whisper network. Within months, the rhyme spread from Yorkshire to the Cotswolds, from the valleys of Wales to the coasts of Cornwall. It travelled faster than any royal proclamation because it didn't need parchment or couriers. It just needed breath. The authorities couldn't stop it. How do you arrest a song? How do you put a melody on trial? By the time the king's men realized that 3 bags full was a critique of their administration, it was too late. It was already embedded in the culture. Every time a child sang it, they were unknowingly participating in an act of rebellion. They were keeping the record straight. The boy in the hut might not have survived the winter of 1276. Many didn't, but his story did. The rhyme became a ghost story that didn't know it was dead. It was a capsule of memory, sealed tight against the senses, designed to carry the truth of their suffering into the future. They couldn't leave us statues. They couldn't leave us memoirs. So they left us a song, and for 700 years, we kept their secret perfectly, until we decided to fix it. For 700 years, the secret slept. The rhyme survived the Black Death. It survived the War of the Roses. It survived the English Civil War. It was passed from mother to child, an unbroken chain of memory, hiding its scars in plain sight. But then, it ran into an enemy that King Edward I could never have imagined. It ran into a borough council in Birmingham. In 1986, parents across the UK opened their morning newspapers to find a story that seemed like a joke. But it wasn't. Reports began to surface that nursery schools in Islington and Birmingham were banning Baa Baa, Black Sheep. The charge? Racism. A moral panic had gripped the educational establishment. A working group had decided that the word black in the rhyme was a derogatory reference. They argued that teaching children to sing about a black sheep was subconsciously reinforcing negative racial stereotypes. Some theories even emerged claiming the rhyme was a mockery of the Atlantic slave trade, despite the fact that the song was written 300 years before that trade even began. But facts rarely stand in the way of a good scandal. The directive went out. The lyrics had to change. And so, the black sheep, the medieval symbol of luxury, the prize of the English flock, was erased. In its place, children were taught to sing about Baa Baa, green sheep, Baa Baa, happy sheep, and, most bizarrely, Baa Baa, rainbow sheep. On the surface, this looked like progress. It looked like kindness. Who could argue against inclusion? Who could argue against making a song friendlier? But when you understand the history we just uncovered, this wasn't kindness. It was vandalism. By changing the lyrics to rainbow sheep, we didn't fix a problem. We created a tragedy. Think about the irony. The original rhyme was a protest song written by the oppressed class of the 13th century. It was a cry of poverty from people who were being crushed by the state. The black in the rhyme wasn't a racial slur. It was an economic fact. It represented the most valuable thing the poor farmer possessed, the rare wool that could save his family from starvation. The black sheep was the hero of the story. By banning the word, modern society took the one thing the peasant had left, his dignity, and labelled it offensive. We took a song about the struggle of the working class and sanitized it into meaningless gibberish about a rainbow sheep that doesn't exist. The rainbow sheep has no wool tax. The rainbow sheep has no starving master. The rainbow sheep is just a hallucination of a comfortable society that is terrified of the dark. This is the ultimate irony of historical revisionism. In our rush to be politically correct, we actually sided with the king. We finished the job that Edward I started. He took the wool. We took the memory. There is a profound disconnect here. Imagine a grandfather in 1986. He learned the rhyme from his father, who learned it from his father, stretching back to the coal mines of the 19th century and the fields of the 17th. To them, the song was a piece of heritage, and suddenly he is told by a council board, people with university degrees and comfortable salaries, that his heritage is racist. He is told that the song he sang to his children is an act of hate. He doesn't know about the wool tax of 1,275. He doesn't know the economic history. He just knows that something old and true is being taken away and replaced with something plastic and fake. The debates raged on the BBC. Tabloids screamed. Academics argued. But in all that noise, nobody stopped to ask, what was the song actually about? We were so obsessed with 20th century anxieties that we projected them onto 13th century farmers. We imagined an oppression that wasn't there, racism in the rhyme, and completely ignored the real oppression that was there, starvation and class warfare. This touches on a darker secret about how we treat history. We like our nursery rhymes to be safe. We want them to be cute. We want the sheep to be happy and the bags to be full of gifts. But history isn't cute. It is full of wolves, and winter, and taxes. When we rewrote the lyrics, we essentially said that we cannot handle the reality of the past. We prefer a lie that feels good over a truth that hurts. We kept the melody, but we lobotomized the meaning. Today, when a child sings Baa Baa, Rainbow Sheep, they aren't participating in that 700-year-old chain of memory. The link is broken. The protest is silenced. The ghost of the medieval shepherd is finally exorcised, not by a priest, but by a committee of well-meaning bureaucrats. What does it say about us? It says that we are quick to judge what we don't understand. It says that we are willing to sacrifice deep historical truth for surface-level comfort. We looked at a black sheep, a symbol of survival against the odds, and we saw only our own modern prejudices reflected back at us. We didn't see the wool. We didn't see the tax. We didn't see the tears. We just saw a colour, and we panicked. But the paint always peels eventually. The headlines of the 1,980 seconds have faded. The outrage has moved on to other things, but the rhyme remains. And now that you know the truth, the rainbow sheep looks ridiculous. It looks like what it is, a cheap coat of paint over a masterpiece of sorrow. The black sheep is still there, waiting beneath the censorship, waiting to tell you the story of the master, the dame, and the boy who lost everything. So, where does that leave us? Today, when a child sings Baa Baa, Black Sheep, they are unwittingly performing a historical reenactment. They don't know it, but they are channeling the voices of 13th century rebels. Every time those words are spoken, it is a ghost story. It is a voice from the winter of 1,276, still crying out about an injustice that destroyed lives and communities long before we were born. The farmers who created this rhyme could never have imagined that it would outlive the English monarchy's absolute power. They couldn't have known it would outlast the Catholic Church's temporal authority. They certainly couldn't have guessed it would survive the moral panics of the 1,980 seconds. But the rhyme endured because its creators understood something fundamental about human nature. Power might control the present, but it cannot control memory. If that memory is hidden cleverly enough, they put their truth in the one place authority figures would never think to look. They hid it in the mouths of children. They hid it in the world of innocence. And perhaps that is the rhyme's final lesson. It isn't really about wool, or taxes, or kings. It is about the power of stories to carry truth across the abyss of time. The shepherds of 1,275 couldn't fight King Edward's armies. They couldn't reclaim their wool, but they could claim their story. And in the end, the story won. The king is dust. The tax is forgotten history. But the song is still being sung. History is filled with these ghosts' innocent songs, strange traditions, and forgotten words that hide dark secrets in plain sight. We just have to be willing to listen to them. If you want to help us decode the next mystery and uncover the truths that history books tried to erase, click that subscribe button. The past is louder than you think. You just have to know the tune.